Ben from Bachphotography here, and today we are looking at how to take photos of wedding rings and other detail shots that you need to do at a wedding. So today we were looking at this photo that I took here at a wedding recently, and I'm going to go through the equipment I used, the specs of the camera when I took this photo, as well as a couple of little hints and tips just when you have to take your own detail shots of rings, jewelry and things like that during a wedding. So, the equipment I used for this photo was a Sony a7R II, a Canon 70mm 2.8 macro lens, and a Sigma MC11 adapter. So, for detail shots, I think it's really important that you use a macro lens when you're taking those sorts of photos, just so you can get super close to your subject. With this photo, I was using a macro lens, and I was able to get super close to the ring over here, just so that that's the focus of the shot. So it's obvious that that's what the photo is about, and also so you can get some really nice detail in the ring. And if you're going to use a non-macro lens, you're going to run into the issue of getting too close to your subject, which is in this case the flower in the ring, and your lens isn't going to actually be able to focus that close to the subject, which means that you're going to have to move further back from the subject, and then it's going to be smaller in the frame. So that's why using a macro lens can be really great for these sorts of detail shots, because you can really fill the frame out with the subject of the image because you can get super close. So let's talk about specifications of the photo. So I shot this at f6.3, a shutter speed of 1/80th of a second, and an ISO of 500. So these settings might seem a little bit weird to you if you're not used to shooting macro photography, but let me just explain exactly what's going on here. So the reason I shot at f6.3 is because the closer you are to your subject, the shallower the depth of field is going to be in your photo. So if you're focusing on something that's super close, you're going to have a super narrow depth of field when compared to your aperture. So if I was to shoot this at say 2.8 or 2.5, 2.0, you would have such a shallow depth of field that in this particular photo that the entire ring jewel wouldn't be in focus. And shooting at f6.3, if you were doing portraits or if you were doing any other style of photography where your subject is, more than 30 centimeters away from your lens, you're not going to have a very shallow depth of field because your lens is not focusing really close. But when you're focusing really close, such as with macro photography, even having an aperture of 6.3 or 7.1 or higher can still produce a very shallow depth of field. So even though, as you can see here, I was shooting at an aperture of 6.3, I'm getting a really shallow depth of field around this flower over here. So that's the reason I shot at f6.3. When you're shooting macro photography like this with rings, I don't like to go any lower than about 5.6, and if I can help it, I'd much rather shoot at an aperture of about 7.1 or f8, just so I can get enough of a depth of field that my subject is in focus. So the reason I shot at a shutter speed of 1/80th of a second is because my aperture was stopped down quite far to 6.3, and that meant that I wasn't actually getting that much light coming into my sensor because the aperture is quite narrow. So I needed to use a very slow shutter speed so that I could compensate for my narrow aperture. And my hands are quite shaky, so I don't really like to shoot super low shutter speeds because I find that I get a lot of blur in my images. So 1/80th of a second was about as slow as I could go before I started, just firing off heaps of shots and all of them coming out blurry. I think I shot 3 or 4 photos in continuous high burst mode just to get this one sharp, because the camera is, the lens was a 70mm, so it's not a long telephoto, but it's certainly not a wide angle. So any camera shake at low shutter speeds is amplified compared to a wide angle lens. So that's why I shot 1/80th. It would have been nice if I'd had a monopod or a tripod, something like that, to shoot a little bit lower, maybe 1/60th, 1/50th, but because I was shooting handheld, 1/80th was about as slow as I could get before I'd start getting shakiness in the image. So because I shot at a shutter speed of 1/80th at a aperture of 6.3 and we were indoors, that meant that the image was quite dark at the native ISO of my camera, which is 100. So because of that, I needed to compensate and boost my ISO up to 500 so that I could get a nice exposure in the image. Now ideally I would have liked the ISO to be a bit lower, but because I was already shooting at such a slow shutter speed and quite a a wide aperture for macro photography, I really couldn't drop either of those settings lower to compensate for a lower ISO. So 500 was a pretty good compromise that I could still have relatively good detail in the image, but then also get a nice exposure as well. So let's go ahead and start editing this image. First of all, I'm just going to bump the clarity up, and I might reverse some of these changes that I'm making as I go. I really like getting ring shots inside flowers, just because pretty much every single wedding has flowers, so there's always an opportunity to just chuck the ring into the flower and get a really beautiful macro shot that way. Some people say that these sorts of shots are a little bit cheesy, but I think normally the bride and groom really love them, so it's always worth just doing a quick one because they're quite simple to do, and I mean everyone always has flowers at their wedding, so that makes it easy. So just changing, a couple of the highlight, shadows, whites, clarity, vibrance settings there. One thing that you'll realize when you're shooting macro photography in flowers is that these petals here can sort of act like a gel for the ambient light. So because this flower in particular is yellow, you can actually get quite a strong yellow cast in your image if you're shooting macro in this area, and you can sort of see that here. It's not too bad. This seems pretty good, although this here was white and it has a bit of a yellow tinge because of the flowers sort of acting as a gel on the light. So you can just correct that by changing the temperatures here, but I don't think it's too much of an issue in this photo. And also if it's a really big issue, you can always make a black and white photo and then adjust the blacks and whites and that sort of thing and still get a beautiful photo. But I think in this one we can keep it color because it doesn't look too bad. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to play with the greens, make them a little bit more airy and white and bright. So I think that looks quite nice. I might crank that up a little bit more and drop the saturation a little bit actually. That looks pretty good, and it doesn't look like we have too many aquas in here, but I'll just boost them up a little bit because I want to keep this image just have yellows and greens in it really. So I'm just gonna play around with all the other ones as well. So there is definitely a lot of blue in this image. So despite having quite a yellow cast, there's still quite a lot of blue in here. So I'm just going to boost the blues up a little bit. Might be a little bit too much. Yep, that looks good. Maybe I'll drop. As you can see here, if I drop the blues, it makes this look a lot more crisp and remove some of the cast, which I kind of like. So I'm going to drop the blues a little bit as well. And that looks pretty good. Play with the contrast a little bit as well. Yep, that looks great. So now that I've changed all of these settings here, I might have introduced a little bit of noise in the image. So I'm just going to open this up now into native Photoshop and have a look to see if there's any noise. So it looks like it's actually pretty clean. Let's really zoom in here. So you can see there is definitely a little bit of noise happening. Not too bad. We might just run a quick despeckle on the image, but I don't want to get any detail lost in this ring. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select this ring here, and I'll just shift click and drag around here as well, just because I missed a little spot. Go to select inverse, so now I have a selection of everything aside from this ring. I'm just going to go to filter, noise, and despeckle. Okay, so now let's have a look at the noise in this image. So that's looking quite a lot better. If we go before, like that, and then after, that is definitely looking a lot smoother. Great. So next thing, I'm just going to clean up the flower a little bit here, just because it was quite a warm day, so it was starting to wilt in certain areas. So I'm just going to get the patch tool and just clean up the flower a little bit. Don't want to go too crazy on this because you still want the flower to look realistic, and really the bride and groom aren't looking that carefully at the flower, so wouldn't worry about it too much. But yeah, if the flower's starting to show a little bit of wilting, you can just correct that by patching up certain sections of the flower. And it is always nice to really go into detail with these sorts of photos and take pride in your craft and just clean up any little things that are imperfect in the image. So just a few more here and there, and we're almost done. One more there too. Great, so let's have a look now. That's looking pretty good. One thing also to notice is I don't ever clean my sensor, so you can see some blobs like this one here, which is just a bit of dust on my sensor. So when you're shooting at a high aperture, let's say 5.6 or above, any dust that's on your sensor will be actually visible in the image. If you're shooting at low apertures, it won't be, but if you're shooting at high apertures, you'll certainly see a little bit of dust here and there. And as you can see, there's one here too, and one here as well. Please roast me in the comments about cleaning my sensor. That's totally fine. I deserve it. Yep, that looks good. I'm not sure if that's a piece of dust or if it's just bokeh. I'm not sure. I'm just going to remove it anyway. And that looks like it's a bit of dust too, so I might just remove that. Okay, great. So I think I'm pretty much done now with this image. I might just remove this little white bit here because it's kind of bugging me. Much better. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this video. And make sure you subscribe as well. I'm going to be producing a lot more content like this in the future. Please leave a comment telling me what you think of this image, what I could have done to improve it, what you would have done to improve it. And once again, thank you very much for watching.